the reason why we are doing this project at this time is because in the recent past there have been instances in Africa and even beyond Africa, you would say, whereby there have been changes to presidential term limits that allow either for governance for life, presidential, that somebody can be a president for life, or that means that age limits for presidential candidates have been removed, so that somebody can run for president at any particular age. So the problem with that is that it can lead to impunity, abuse of power, violations of human rights. And so we felt that this was a critical moment to start discussions within us, especially within the East African region, on the importance of control of power.
Think about Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and in some ways Iraq and Syria. Syria less so. All countries that have been plunged into major internal disputes, some cases, Syria particularly, and Yemen, amounting to civil war. The only one that managed this process peacefully was Tunisia. And Libya is still involved in a civil war. Why? Well, to a very considerable extent, because the heads of state in those countries, the presidents, had been there for a very long time, and people became convinced that they weren't going to be able to get rid of them by other means, and therefore there was some form of uprising, some of it violent, some of it, of course, backed by foreign powers. In Syria, there was an additional factor. President Assad, of course, had succeeded his father, so the Assad family had been there for a rather long time. There's also an issue of Shia and Sunni and so on. A lot of dissatisfaction because the president comes from the minority Muslim sect. But in other words, if people get stuck in a position for decades, then sometimes the populace feels the only way to get rid of them is by some sort of uprising, or maybe through a coup or something like that. Something which is, from looking at the experience of those countries, again with the exception of Tunisia, a related problem that there doesn't seem any widely acceptable successor. You get rid of your dictator, but the thing about having a dictator, or somebody, it doesn't have to be, in theory, not a dictator, but that's another problem. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the person who's been there for a very long time, they don't groom successors. So when they're suddenly removed, then there's a huge fight over who's going to take over. And so that's part of the problem. The second one comes back to this word dictator. In theory, there should be absolutely no reason why a person who's in office for a very long time should be a dictator. Or at least they should be what people like to imagine, a benevolent dictator. But benevolent dictators are very few and far between. And this is because of power corrupting. To remain in office in this way, you must have such an enormous belief in your own capacities and the lack of capacities of anybody else that you'll get to be convinced that whatever you want is right. You will end up with fewer people advising you. You'll become intolerant of dissent because they're interfering with your vision of what you are doing. It is very, very hard to think of people who've been in office for a very long time, and people say, but he's just doing such a wonderful job. It doesn't seem to work out like that.
If you have a situation where only a handful of people, groups can secure offices of the state, then it is not a democratic country, really. So if you want a democratic country where everybody is treated equally, every community is treated fairly, we are not really going to have a democracy that we can be proud of. And in all these areas that I have been mentioning, the role of the president has been critical and will probably continue to be very critical. So because the role of the president is so crucial in the way the country is fashioned and democracy is exercised, that we have to pay very close attention to how do we secure a president, how is it fair process, how does it also represent interests of the people as a whole, not tribe as a role. And I think myself that one of the most important issues about the election of the presidency is precisely these broader questions, because the president inevitably is going to have a lot of powers. We could try within the Constitution to make the president's decision-making more democratic than perhaps it is, and there are ways of doing that. But unless we have in office people who are genuinely thinking of the country as a whole, we will probably continue caught up in tribal politics. And if it is tribal politics, it is the few, 2 or 3 really big tribes, because we have lots of tribes here, and some are very small, and our devolution has to some extent accommodated the poor, but really very small amount. So the position of the presidency is crucial in a number of ways like this. And therefore, it is something that we should be spending money thinking of. What should be the form of elections? How frequently would one person be allowed more than at the most two terms, however popular he may be, because he may be popular among the larger tribes, so that's not a test anymore. And so we need something like this as a guard against perpetuating some particular tribes. So we have to look at it also not just in terms of a family of a person, but in a broader term of the country as such, and nationhood, fairness, minorities. So I think it's all tied up to these bigger questions. And if you read our Constitution, it is full of these questions.
So in terms of what has been happening in the continent, in terms of this pattern of countries backsliding of transfer of powers between political regimes and peaceful transfer of powers, in the last quarter of last year, under the auspices of the Kofi Annan Foundation and other organizations, including National Democratic Institute, they convened a high-level meeting involving former heads of states, academics, civil society organizations to look and exchange best practices in relation to peaceful transfer of power and presidential term limits. And from that meeting, they declared a document known as the Niamey Declaration on Constitutionalism and peaceful transfer of power and presidential term limits, advocating for exactly what that title says, peaceful transfer of power and presidential term limits.
It's depressing to see how frequently around the world referendums actually endorse a change of the constitution in order to allow somebody to remain in office. And I think the only thing that civil society can really do is to educate people about this, the importance of this topic. You know, we've seen something rather similar here recently, which is the takeover of Nairobi by the national government. People have got so fed up with Sonko that they welcomed this. And now we have, to my mind, an unconstitutional arrangement, because I do not believe they had the power to do what they did. And people don't care that it was unconstitutional and against the rule of law. And so it actually takes an awful lot of sophistication in some ways to realize that just because you like the result of something that has been achieved by illegitimate means doesn't mean that you should overlook the illegitimacy of the means. Next time round, you may not like the result of not following the law. It's a bit like people who sort of celebrate when they get the court decision they want, regardless of whether or not the reasoning was actually right. Actually, the rule of law is important, because at the end of the day, it's the thing that's most fair to everybody. And if you don't respect the rule of law in one respect, why should you respect it in another? And also, I think there are very few examples around the world that you could look to and say, term limits don't matter. Let the person remain there forever. You know, the examples are not very encouraging. Obviously, Museveni is an example. Kagame is a bit different. It at least seems to be running a country that operates well, but is extremely intolerant of dissent to an extreme degree. But people, it's very hard, I know, to convince people beyond the immediate situation that something they think seems like a good idea at the time may not be a good idea in 10 years' time, for example. And again, I think this is a problem with a presidential system. I think a parliamentary system cuts the whole notion of the head of government down to size, whereas the presidential system blows people up like a balloon. And people don't want to puncture the balloon. So there's just not this same sort of awe and reverence for heads of government in a parliamentary system. You expect them to do their job, and I think that's probably the better. And if they get a lot of respect, it's by virtue of their own abilities, not because of the office they hold. By the way, one little story, don't know whether you've heard of it, you probably have because you've been looking at this issue. What can one do about it? Do you know the story of the Honduras Constitution? In the Constitution of Honduras, in the Caribbean, there was not only a term limit, but it said that anybody who was holding the office and set out to change the term limit automatically lost his office. And the president of Honduras tried it. and was removed by the military, who said, "You've lost your office." The poison pill they call it, right? You do something and an automatic consequence follows, and he was removed. I'm not sure I would recommend it, but it's a very interesting and ingenious device.